Okay, I won't be streaming for too long. I'm going to be making the input buffer into a cache that is on the manager rather than the specific methods calling to the input manager. And I think that way we can have inputs be cached at any point rather than cached specifically on um, outside methods outside the manager. What I'm thinking right now is I could cache um, on each object an input, and this would allow me to have any sort of input have a cache. So let's say we have a primary cache for the primary button, which is like left click, which is attacking with your main hand. We could have a cache just for that. Uh, and I think that would be the better option because the alternative is having a global cache for all inputs. Um, so the way to think about it is, let's say we are trying to do a primary attack. The way that we would read that is the player clicks left click while they are not able to attack. So that gets cached into, let's start with the global cache first as an example. The player left clicks, that gets put into the global cache, and they're not able to attack. So it's in the cache. Then they right click, or they jump, or they do something else that's not a primary input. So now in the cache, if we're looking at it globally, we're always going to look at the top one first. So let's say we get to the point that we can now attack. Then we're going to look to the cache for that second input, the jump, the right click. And we're going to see that that's available, not the left click. And so we won't left click, we'll do one of the other ones. But if instead we have it as a local thing for each input object, then what we could do is have just the primary button be cached. And then when we're able to attack, we look to that, we see that it's cached, and we do the attack. And that way you could do multiple caches. So let's say you left click and jump, those are both cached, and you're not able to do either. And then all of a sudden you can do both. Now they're both in the cache. You look at it, grab it, there it is. And I think that'd be better because if we think of the cache being accessed on a per frame basis, it's possible that two different events will be looking at the cache. Like if this is global, they'll be looking at the global cache and they will see this event is at 0.0 and the other one will see this event's at 0.1, like index 1 of the array of caches. And once it gets used, it needs to be removed. So what we would have is the first event, which would say, like, let's say the primary click, it sees its thing at position 0, then the jump sees position 1. Well, if the primary removes 0 after the first one has seen that it's at 1 and then goes to grab that, but now the queue's been shifted, it might grab the wrong thing. It might not work that way because it's all on one instant, so it shouldn't work that way. But I feel like that's a bad way to set up the system if that is like in some way at all possible. So I think it would be better to have a per object cache. That way we just simply cache has this button specifically been clicked in the last 0.5 seconds. I think that's the better way to do it. So that's how I'm going to set it up. And I'll probably have a global static variable for the wait time on it. Well, it'll be on the input object, but it'll be for each input object. I'm going to set the cache limit to 1 second for now, just for testing. But in reality, it'll probably be closer to like 0.5 or 0.3, something very small. So I made the cache for the input event for when a button is pressed, but I'm thinking I probably shouldn't have cache events for like axis inputs. So for example, look rotation, move rotation. Well, look rotation or movement, because those are on axes. And I figure it'd be really weird to have those have input buffers because it'd be like I think that would be too jarring to have like just a couple inputs, because essentially we'd only cache like your input like 3 times you've done the input. So you'd essentially have this like jittered 3-step, like 3-frame movement after you're like stunned or something, where I think that'd be really weird. So we're only going to cache button inputs. And this should be good for setting it up. Basically, what I'm doing is we have a specified length for our cache, and it's going to be in an array. I was going to do a list at first, but then I realized it'd be much more performant to do a array with a specified limit. And then what we're doing is checking through that array to look for an empty slot. And we do that from the beginning, look for an empty slot and then assign it. And then we save the index we assigned it to. And I started at -1 so I can check that we actually assigned it. Here we're checking, did we actually assign it? If we did not, I guess I might as well comment this. Check that the event was cached. We can put here if empty, cache the event. So we're going through and trying to find an empty slot, and then we cache the event once we find the empty slot. I think 3 is a good limit for the amount we can have in cache. I feel like that might even be too much. Like maybe we just have 2. But this would let you do like 3 left clicks or 3 right clicks or 3 any button presses, and maybe you're doing a combo or something where that makes sense to kind of allow that input buffer. You can think of it in fighting games. Fighting games absolutely have input buffers, because what you can do is make a combo before you're actually ready to do it. So let's say the combo is like X, Y, X, 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 Y. What you can do is press X, Y, X, 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 Y. And even though those animations haven't actually happened yet, your input will go through into the game because it has an input buffer. And so what it's doing is it's caching those inputs and then calling to them when they're actually available. So I think this is the right approach for doing an input buffer, as opposed to what I was doing before. What I was doing before, just to clarify, is I need to pull up the player script for the adaptable object. Okay. What I was doing before was that you would do the input. So you would make an input, and then that input would get cached, and we would wait until the input is actually used to uncache it. The problem with this is we're only caching it when we're in a state that allows for this to happen. So the input offhand suck only happens, let's look for the other instance. Okay. So it only happens when we're in the forecast state. So let's say you're finishing an attack and you're in the post action, then you can't do this input. So it's not going to even register that you have pressed it to put it into that buffer. So it's flawed in that way. But now instead, since we're doing this where we store cache there, what we can do instead of doing this, we would do like, we would go input manager, find, and then we would find that button press, which is, I believe, oh, we would also not want this to be, we don't want this to be, actually, here's what we could do. We could, on state change, have a check. So it's going to look a bit sloppy right now, but what we could do is on state change, have a check where we go input manager, just how we have it here, where we get this, we do input manager.find, and then we say cache. Well, how's this going to work? Okay. We're going to have a way to pull from this cache, so we should make this I am on the wrong one. Okay. So if we make this public, this event cache, and then Okay, so event cache, and we could do this. We could actually have like an if check here, then have a method that'll return. So if it's not equal to null, then we can fire the event here, which is going to be attempt offhand blast. So we can instead do and that way, the moment we enter this state, we check if you have an input. We check that you have an input there, and then we can fire it. So that's my idea. It's as opposed to having you have to be in this state to even register the input, then that's flawed because it's not functioning as a buffer when you're not able to do it, which completely defeats the purpose of having a buffer if we can't do an input while we're not in the state to do that input. So yeah, that's the reason I'm converting this to a system that's stored here. I'm also thinking, oh no, okay. I was thinking, why would we even store the event if we already know it's going to be this object? So my thinking there was, we know that this is going to be the secondary button, and if something's stored there, we know it's a secondary press because it's specific to this button action. But then I realized just now, we are going to need to cache the event because we need to know what the input type is. If we wanted to, we could only cache the input type because that's all we really need. That's the only information we need. Actually, yeah, that's exactly what we should do, because this is just caching what the event is, which doesn't make sense to do a cache there. So really, what we should be doing is caching an event type. That's how this should work. Because we're caching what sort of button press it is, not what the event is. We don't care about what the event is for this. That's the other script's job to know. Like, that's this script's job to know that this is the event for it. So we should just be caching this. Okay, that makes sense. But now we can't have it as null. So what we'll need to do is go to this enum and add one more for null. We could also do this. If it will, it should allow -1. I think it's, maybe it's that I have to have every single one. Actually, it makes more sense to do like, why is it thinking we can't do this? Maybe the other way. Okay, yeah, just this way. Okay, we could do something like that, or maybe I'd want this. I don't know. But that's the reason I'm making this cache event, so we can do something where we select from the cache where an input can be stored no matter the state of the object. And then we can look if it is cached on the moment we switch state. If this is cached, then let's do that immediately. Otherwise, we can just wait for an input like usual. Yeah, okay. I think that's a good explanation of what I'm trying to do here. Just making a quick change here because I realized it'd be better to have down be -1, up be 1, and hold be 0. This will make it in the future. This will make it a lot easier to change an axis to a button or a button to an axis. It'll still be a fairly difficult task to do, but ideally I would let the player change an axis input to a button input. That way, let's say you want to, for whatever sadistic reason, you want to change your camera rotation to the arrow keys on your keyboard, so you look with your arrow keys rather than the mouse. It would be useful to have looking down, which would be -1 anyways, equate to down -1, looking up equate to 1. Same with movement. Let's say you wanted to change the movement to your mouse, again, if you're some sadistic person who wants to do that. Or a case where that actually makes sense, let's say the controller. Now, this is already something that Unity has something for, where you can change what type of input it is. But let's say you want to go from a button to an axis for player movement, like going to a controller. Then it's easier to do that if down on the button. Actually, wait. No, that wouldn't be right at all because it's two different buttons, not one button. So that wouldn't make sense. Still, I think it's better just logically to have hold be 0, down be -1, up be 1. So we're going to make null -10. I think that makes more sense for this case. Yeah, and then we'll have a null part of this input, and that way we can store null. So we can say here, if it is equal to null, then do that. And we will also need to say this. I'm actually not sure what they would default to, but what we want to do is when we do this, we're going to do, I was going to say we could put it like append it with like this, but since it's a varied length, what people want to do is go for each. An array of that. And then what we'll do is for each input manager dot input enum input type in event cache, we can say input type equals null, and now they'll default to null. Actually, convert it to 4. The amount of stuff you can do with an IED, no, that's a bomb. IDE is crazy. Like converting this to a for loop. I mean, when you think about it, it's really not that complex of a procedure, but it is really cool that there's features like that didn't exist like even just 2 years ago. At least for Visual Studio, I'm sure it existed somewhere. But anyways, for each one, you'll say it is equal to null. We can get rid of that. Okay. Now you got that. Now we just need to store it and check that it works. We'll see. Okay, I'm not too sure what the issue is, but I need to hop off right now. So I'll work on this tomorrow, but it doesn't seem too bad. I should be able to figure it out. I'm gonna end here though. Yeah. I'm going to be working on the input buffer. My goal is to get it set up so that it is able to cache inputs for each type of input. Well, each key press of an input. So like left click has its own cache, right click has its own cache, spacebar has its own cache. Or I guess more specifically, it's the actual action. So primary fire, which could be left click or right trigger on a controller or anything else that the player wants to assign to it. And then secondary, jump. So all of those can have their own cache. That's the goal. So what I'm doing right now is working to make every single call return a Boolean. That way we have a check. We have a way to check whether or not a call actually succeeded or failed. We already have the functionality to see whether or not something fails or not. The only difference is we're not returning that value. So actually returning it is going to be pretty straightforward. We just have to out these values that we were otherwise not outing and just using for the method or for the checks. So we essentially just need to return those checks that we were otherwise discarding, which is pretty straightforward. All right, so it's having issues with my old code, and there's no point to go back and change my old code. So I think this is the point where I finally delete all this old player code. It'll still be in GitHub if I need to get it, but I'm finally going to delete it now from the actual project. I'm also going to get rid of the old AI because it relied on the player code. So I'm going to delete this stuff too. This is one of those moments I'm really happy GitHub exists because I definitely would not just delete all of this stuff if I didn't have backups ready. Although this is quite a lot to delete, a lot of code, which kind of sucks for the fact that it's you know, still code that I wrote and put time into writing, but it's just not that good, so have to get rid of it. And I could probably just delete the whole thing. I will definitely reference some of it for when I go back to AI, but it is the case that all of that code's not usable anymore. Let's see. We can just delete this whole prefab. Okay. All right. Now that's gone. I might as well take this time to clear out all the other stuff too. Like this stuff we won't need. Actually, these are just objects, so we might as well keep them since we might use them. Okay, and then I think that'll also break stuff if we get rid of it right now, so we'll leave that. Player, now it's just that. And get rid of that. And so now we've just got our input manager. Okay. So now that's all taken care of, got rid of all that. And now it is time to see if this actually works, which I don't think it will. Yeah, let's see. So we get at least input going now. I don't know why the feet aren't working. That part makes no sense, because axes should be working just fine. Let's see. Let's go to where we have the input for that. Okay, I'm gonna try to figure out what's going wrong here and then see why we're having some of the events work but others are not. This might actually be a bad way to do this, but essentially what I'm doing here is I'm saying that if the integer value of the enum is modulo 2, if that is not equal to 0, then add it to the event. What I'm doing here is I'm adding events that are up or down, but I'm kind of just being cheeky about it because I've assigned these values as -1 and 1 if we go here. So down is -1, up is 1, null is -10, hold is 0. So -1 modulo 2 is going to have a 1 remainder, 1 modulo 2 is going to have a 1 remainder as well. Then -10 modulo 2 will have no remainder, and 0. I believe I should actually double check what 0 modulo 2 is, because I don't know if it would be 0 or 2. It's 0, okay. So that would be 0 as well. So what we can do is do that. It's kind of, maybe it's not the right way to do it, but it works in this case. And I'll probably end up regretting it later on, but have it like this for now, just to be cheeky about it, I guess. But I'll be honest, I didn't know that events could return booleans until yesterday, when I thought, like, what if I could just flip this to a boolean and then have the event be boolean? Because it doesn't really make sense for an event to be boolean, considering you can have an event be multiple things, like do event plus equals store something like that, which then like doesn't make sense, because now we're going to be returning two things. So I don't know how it works when you when it's able to do two different things or like multiple methods. I have no idea how that would work, but I know specifically for this it's only ever going to be one thing, so it works. Maybe they're all tied together in an and, so like if one fails they all fail, or maybe it's ors, and if one fails, if one passes, they all pass. I don't know. Definitely something to look into. But I think I'm close to getting this figured out, so that events that fail to fire, meaning they get returned false, are cached, and events that succeed are taken out of the cache if they're in it. And then also we're not going to be taking holds or nulls because we don't want the cache just holding the button, because then the whole cache would just be holding the button. We just want up and down. So we can see on the right there, in the inspector, I've made it serializable so we could see it. You can see when I press down, because I'm forcing the event to fail right now, you can see we get down and then up. So I'll do this like right by the mic so you can hear the click. So it's caching those events, and they only last for 1 second. So if I keep tapping it, it's gonna go through that a bit longer. And what we can do is hopefully chain stuff together if we do this. So now let's test it by spamming the attacks and hope that it works. Oh, also, so what this is doing is every 0.1 seconds, we can change this number, but that's what I have it for now. Every 0.1 seconds while it's in the cache, it's going to try to recall that event and try to get a positive value from that, so like a true. So if we're able to retrieve this event and it fires like true, it gets a return from the call. Like it gets a true return from the call. Then we're gonna break the while loop and set this to null because that we've gotten that input and used that input. But then also, if we reach the max time, we will make it null because we're no longer caching this input. So hopefully this is a good way to do it. I hadn't thought of this when I went into it, but I think it's a good approach to it. And we'll see if it works if I set this back to not return false, but just return what it was before, returning that call. So I think one thing that I might not be emphasizing enough here is because of how I organized every single event to be structured in the same way, which is absolutely not a given when making games. Like, I've been making games for a very long time, and I did not always do that. Maybe that's because I've had a bad practice for a really long time, but I also think it's just not everyone's starting point to be very structured with their code, and it's benefited me a lot in ways I did not expect to have my code very structured. The fact that I could just change every single event to return a Boolean, that took me, less than like 10 minutes to do, maybe less than 5, to make every single action in the game now return a Boolean when otherwise they'd return nothing. That's not exactly a given when making a game, and it's another reason I'm really happy with the event system I've made, because it required redoing my entire project. So it's nice to see that it's actually paying off. And it's probably worth commenting on that a bit just to explain it a little bit more, that these events are structured in such a way that they have the same exact flow no matter what data is passing through. And that allows me to do things like just change all of them very easily. Like, I just changed all of them to return a Boolean. I could also change all of them to have some other variable pass through. I could change all of them to return like a float if I wanted to. It's really easy to change the entire system, which has not been true on any project I've worked on before. But okay, so hopefully this works. So we can actually see this happening. As I press down, you can see in the element 0, I'm pointing at my screen, but you can't see it. It's there, okay. Element 0, you'll see it's up for a second. So like the moment we release it, it gets cached to there, but then just a second later, it gets used. So if you remember the code for the attack, it has to wait 0.2 seconds before you can actually release it. So if you listen to my input real quick, it'll be instantaneous that I let go of the left click. And it's kind of hard. The up is sometimes there, sometimes not. I'll do it quicker. And you can see that up is there. And I think I finally broke it. Yeah, I don't know what I broke, but I broke something. But okay, so what we've done is cache that input. So the way the code works right now is that you would not be able to fire that event. You would not be able to cancel the forecast the moment you've left clicked. So since I'm releasing the moment I left click, it wouldn't technically be able to do canceling the animation because we're not ready yet. But because I've created this input buffer, it waits until that is actually able to happen, and then it fires. So I'm gonna have to look and see what went wrong there, because all of a sudden it stopped working. But we could go here and see, well, sorting through all of this isn't gonna be easy, but okay. So retrieving event of input type, found matching, retrieving, found matching, failed to find. So through when it's doing these, it's like checking. This is when it's checking if it passes, and I'd imagine here like it failed out. Looks like it's not in order for whatever reason, but it should still be the case. That's the way it's flowing. And I'm going to get rid of these tests so we can just see what's happening. And also, we want it to keep it like this, like return true, because if it returns false, we want to continue this stuff down here. We can probably, actually, you know what, let's change all of these to actual logs and then see what's going on. I think the issue is that we weren't checking that this was forecast when we need to be making sure we're in forecast. Hopefully that's the issue. If not, it might be that we're not resetting the event. No, we are. We're resetting the event. But I probably want to get rid of this, right? Because we're doing that normally now. Well, we're doing that within the buffer itself, which is probably the best way to do it, right? I mean, why do it hard-coded in each single one of these when we can just have it within the object itself, store cache, and then while this is going on, try to refire the event that's attached? Because we, in theory, we don't care what event is attached. We just care whether or not it's firing. So if we're able to call it and we get something true back, then that's good. It's on that event for returning true when it shouldn't have, if we get true back. Like, if it's not the event that it's meant to be and we get true back, that's a problem with the code outside of it, not a code within the input manager. Because that should be the case with this. I think what's causing the issue is we didn't have this check in here when we should. So we need to make sure that's there. And hopefully that fixes the issue. It seemed to be pretty consistent, like after several attacks, it does it. And it's already happened now, so that wasn't the issue. Okay. So let's see what it was. I think if I'm reading this correctly, the issue is that we are starting the next animation before that transition finishes. So post action hasn't actually triggered into idle yet, but we're immediately going into forecast. So instead of transitioning into idle like we should, we're transitioning from post action, well, attempting to trigger from post action into forecast, which is impossible. And so it's thinking this call fires when it really doesn't. And so then it's like, okay, we fired that, let's go on to the next one and fire action. But the issue is that we actually can't switch there yet because we're not in idle yet. So I think what we need to do is have a check within the call itself, because this is a global issue that I've seen happen before. I think we need to have a check to see that the animation is in transition or has finished its transition, which luckily we have a easy way to do that. We find our main animator, we go to current set, no, we just do animator, and then we do check, no, not the animator, but just here. Okay, there we go. Is the animation playing? That's what we want, I believe. So basically, this is making sure that the current animation is synced up with what the actual state of the object is. So in this example, what's happening here is our state's being changed to idle, but the animation is still in post action, so they're not synced up. So we should not be able to switch out of a state until those two things are synced up, which is like a matter of less than 0.1 seconds, but it matters obviously in this case where we're doing things instantaneously. So we want to make sure that we have made sure we are checking this. Let me make sure I'm using the right thing here. Okay, wait, current animation to begin. Okay. And we can always use this somewhere else to make sure that we are waiting until that happens. If it's something not in player input, like player input, obviously we can't put a wait because the player is just going to input whenever they want to. But in other cases where it's a AI or something, we would want to do, we could just intentionally have code that says, okay, wait until we finish this animation, then do it. Which I have in other cases. I have done that in other places. I can't remember right now where I did that. I want to say I did that before the input buffer to allow you to do things like follow up and input. But I hadn't realized at that time that this was a global issue that needed to be fixed. This is an inherent missing check within here that we need to make sure. And we can go ahead and put a debug along with this since this is more of a unique case. It won't be an error because it's okay that it happens, but we are going to say like that this failed for this reason. So we're going to log that it failed to call action to state change event. Action has not finished transitioning with animation. Old animation is still playing. Okay. I guess it should be the other way, right? Animation has not finished transitioning with action. Okay. So now we have a log for that, so we can see when that happens. So we should get that error thrown while we're doing this. If this is the issue, we should see that, well, not error, but we should see that fail message appear if I'm right about that being the issue. Again, I could be wrong because I thought I'd already fixed this and I did not. Okay, yeah, we can see that was the issue. We are getting this fire. And it is actually working now. So it would be my guess that the issue was instead of failing out, it was passing through. And so it was trying to move on to the next state when it actually wasn't ready to. So this is absolutely a fundamental check that needs to be within each call, not like a conditional thing that we have sometimes. So I'm glad we caught that and we're able to fix it. And now we're actually catching that error and we see what the problem is. One thing we want to do though is I'm not able to chain these and I want to see exactly why we're not able to do that. So it's the input is working for like the up. You can see it there. You can even see it here. Failed to fire event up, but then obviously we still did it, like we still attacked early because it followed up later on. If we uncollapse this, I'm sure we can see. We failed to fire hold, obviously, because there's nothing to do with hold. And then failed to fire event up. And then this is weird because these actions actually do exist, which it's also weird because it's still firing, right? So that's okay. We will worry about that after this, but we can see if we get back down there. Somewhere in this mess. Okay. Okay, hold up, failed to fire, event is null. And so this is probably right after it actually fired. I don't think we have anything for saying it succeeded, do we? Maybe we do. Successfully fired, event 4. So this should come up. I mean, it's obviously happening. So, okay. So we're getting it for down, but not up, which is really weird. Or maybe that's because, oh, what we really should do, well, I guess we shouldn't. I was gonna say we should just recall this, but then like we'd be restoring an event that's already stored, so that doesn't make sense. So it does make sense to do it like this. The only reason we're not getting this log here is because we should also have it here. Okay. Now, I think I want to say the reason we're not being able to follow up is that it's caching a different input. So we get that up. So it's actually, it's not caching. If I keep clicking, you can hear. It doesn't seem to be caching those inputs, which is weird. Like, why would it not cache it? I wonder if, no, okay, I was gonna say I wonder if it being null affects it, but we don't run it if it's null, so that shouldn't be an issue. I don't know why. Because we can see it caching when we're like here, the up, down. Like if I double tap too, you can see it cache. I wonder, let's see if I bump up that cache time, will it fire that input? So let's go to input object and then change this time. I mean, it's already, no, that's the length. Okay, let's change this to like 3 seconds. To test to see, because right now for some reason it's only caching when we're in idle, which doesn't really make sense, but okay, that actually followed it up. So if you saw the cache there, it added in down, and I didn't click anything, so I'll get my mouse close again. You can see up, down, and it swings again. So that cached as well. Maybe we want something so that it prioritizes down over up because, well, no, because then there could be cases where what you want is up and not down. So it's nice though that they work in tandem. So something I was worried about is that it would only look at the top queue. So you can see sometimes here, obviously the attack is down up, like it's down on the mouse up. But sometimes what you'll see in the queue is the top one is up as we're done with the swing. Like the top one's up there. But even though it was up, the second one was down. And since they're all on their independent loops checking this, it actually didn't have a problem saying, okay, I can do this down input, I'll do that. And then it also, like the one above that, so element 0, let's go ahead and pause it, like just change this. So element 0 was up, element 1 is down. Now in the queue, this one's checking first, then this one's checking second, but it's happening every 0.1 seconds. So for their entirety of 3 seconds in the queue, this one's checking every 0.1 seconds. Can I be run? Can I be run? Can I be run? This one's doing the same thing. Can I be run? Can I be run? Can I be run? Now, the up, so this is as we're finishing an attack. So the attack has gone through, like we're swinging, like action. We're done with the down up. Now, so the next thing we're going to be able to do, the very next thing we're going to be able to do is down for another attack and then up to cut the forecast and immediately do the attack. So even though this one's checking first, like this one's in the front of the queue and it's checking like maybe like 0.05 seconds faster than this, or even just like a frame faster than this, what it's going to happen is it'll iterate through this, alternating. Well, really like this, but then just completely skips this one. Well, no, actually that one's not in the queue at all. So just these two. But it goes here, it sees, okay, we finished the animation, we can do down now. Even though this just checked that same, like just a frame earlier and it couldn't do it. And it goes, okay, we can do this. Set it to null and do the input. Then it goes back to the top again. It sees, okay, we just did that down. Let's try to do this. Okay, we can't do that because remember, we have to wait for it to transition. So it goes another 0.1 seconds and like, okay, actually we have to wait 0.2 seconds because on top of waiting for the animation to go, we have to wait 0.2 seconds. So keep going and then get here and then, okay, now we can actually do it because it's been 0.2 seconds that have passed. And then this fires null. So our input buffer is working in the sense that we can like cascade inputs, and it's grabbing the input that will be soonest available. Now that could have its own issues, but at the moment, I think it's a benefit that it's caching inputs independently and able to fire them independently. So you don't have this instance where the last button you pressed was jump, but you also had cached your primary attacks, like left clicking, swinging. So before what I had was one global thing where, what I thought of doing was having one global thing where you can see jump here and primary here. They were going to be one united thing where top of the queue would be first to go. And so the issue with that is, let's say we cache the jump. Well, now we cannot do this one until this one is out of the queue, which means that either the buffer runs out on that or it's actually used. So with this, what could happen is it doesn't matter which one is in the queue. They each have their own independent queue. And then even within the queue itself, it doesn't matter. The soonest an input can happen, it will happen, which I think is exactly what you want out of an input buffer. I'm sure there will be edge cases where I realize it needs to be tweaked a bit, but seems to be working well. Now it's to figure out why exactly it's only happening when we're in idle. I'd imagine that has something to do with the event being set to null because that seems to be the only difference. I mean, the player state has no impact on the input manager. Like the input manager is grabbing inputs regardless of any object in the scene. It is grabbing inputs. There could be nothing in the scene at all, and it is grabbing inputs from the player. I mean, game manager's got to be there, but no objects in the scene, it's still grabbing inputs. So it doesn't care at all what's happening in here other than what event is assigned to the button. So considering the fact that it's grabbing inputs here and probably here, makes me think that the issue is that these are null. But what's weird is it doesn't make sense that that's an issue because we're checking if it's null. But maybe I'm doing it wrong on the second one. Let's see. So what happens is we go if event is null, return. Okay, that's exactly the issue. We're breaking anyways. Well, no, we still return false here, which is going to go back here and say false. So don't break it, go back through. So if event is not null, return that. So if it's null, it's just going to keep going. Same here. If event's not null, do the thing. So it should return false as well. So that's weird. It's weird that it's not caching it. Could be here, but even this should be okay because there's slots for it. Maybe it's happening so fast. No, because they'd still stay. I could try playing around with setting this to 10 and like see if it is a array limit, but that should not be the issue. So you can see if I spam it right in that beginning, we're only getting it in when we're idle, which is really weird. But the input buffer is working, that's cool. So if I keep spamming this, you can hear me spamming it when I'm not able to do it, and now I've completely stopped, no more inputs. That's pretty cool. But okay. I think I need to leave it there, unfortunately. It's 2 a.m. and I'm trying to fix my sleep schedule. I spent most of today not really working on my project, to be honest. And then the couple hours I did spend on it, I was working on setting up my Steam page for the project because I need to get that ready for the Steam Next Fest. So I obviously couldn't share that because it's under NDA, yeah, non-disclosure agreement with Valve that I do not share my Steam page. Well, obviously behind the scenes of how you set up a Steam page and all that. So couldn't stream that. And so yeah, so this ended up being short. Last few streams have been pretty short, but tomorrow I need to do a lot of work, and hopefully I'll be able to stream most of it. But I will tackle this issue tomorrow, and hopefully we can finally crack it. Today I've been working on a trailer for the Steam page because I need to get the Steam page set up for the Steam Next Fest, which will be in June. And I thought it'd be interesting to show the beta page for my Steam page. So this isn't my Steam page is not public yet, but I can show the beta page of what it looks like as if it was on the Steam page. So I grabbed a bit of it here to show as little of it as possible. This is essentially if you were to look at other games like Dust Remains. And so I was working on cover art for the game because I think my old cover art, I like it, but it's not exactly, it doesn't exactly say what goes on in the game. So if you have seen the game before, either when I'm starting up a build or played it yourself, you'll know the cover art currently is a hand that's like a statue and it's crumbling apart, and then there's a rose in its hand, which I think is really nice for the themes of the game, but it makes it look more like a game like Journey or some more emotional game rather than an action one. So I think this is a better compromise because it shows that the game's about combat, while also still being kind of true to the themes of the game. And the reason I don't have text of what the game is because I don't know how to do stylized text. Like, I've gotten better at art throughout the years, but if there's one thing I can't do, it's make text look good. Aside from obviously just like using regular fonts, which isn't good enough for a game. So I thought, what if I just don't have text? And at first it was just simply because I didn't have the skill to make text on the cover art. But then when I started thinking about it more, I thought, well, I want my game to stand out on the store. And I'm realizing now, looking at the page where it's like, look at other similar games, I think it really sticks out that my game is pretty much the only one that doesn't show its name. You can see 3 of the recommended here: Deathloop, Cruelty Squad, Dishonored, which it took a lot of changing the tags of the game to get that to work, because I think it's very important that people know what this game is like so that they can hopefully try it out if they like the games that I think this is similar to, which Dishonored, Cruelty Squad, Deathloop, the immersive sim genre is pretty accurate to what I want my game to be. But I didn't realize just how beneficial it could be to not have a title on it. Like, it's one of those things that you assume I ought to do it this way because this is how it's done. But then when you actually consciously think about it, it's like, why would I even put the name of my game on the cover art, right? Like, the cover art is meant to draw you in, not tell you what the name of my game is. That's what the title is for. Because, I mean, think about it. Is there anything in a name that has ever drawn you to play a game? I can't think of any game where I've seen the title and thought, okay, now I want to play it. It's like when you click on a game, I actually think having your title is counterproductive to the point of the cover art. Because when I am looking at games on Steam, instead of just looking at the cover art for what it is, I'm almost always reading it. And so, although obviously you can't isolate your brain to do one thing, like I'm not just reading it, I'm also looking at it, I think the fact that I am reading is kind of taking away from the fact that I'm looking at what is meant to be artwork, like just simply artwork meant to draw you in. And why would you want to dirty your art with text over it that says the name of the game? To me, that comes off as either A, following the trend, which literally I think every game on Steam shows the title. So, I mean, that makes sense. I certainly wouldn't blame anyone for that because it's what I would have done had I had skill to put text on there, or the stylistic choice to do something gross like Cruelty Squad. But like now that I've actually thought about it, it seems to detract from the actual point of the cover art to show what the game is rather than just tell you what the name of the game is. Like the other thing, if it's not just following a trend, then the alternative would be you want people to know the name of your game. And to me, I think if knowing the name of the game takes away from you actually clicking on the game, then I'd rather you just not know the name of the game. But I do think I had the idea for this cover art, and I thought it would be pretty nice. But I realized after the fact that it's actually representative of the title itself. I've always known that there was going to be dual meaning to Dust Remains, not even dual meaning, like multi-meaning to the phrase Dust Remains, because I like to have a lot of buried meaning in things that I won't overtly tell you, but I will know is there, and hopefully people can pick up on. But I'm going to make it obvious at this moment, which is the game is called Dust Remains, and in this image of the cover art, it's the remains of the Mole King, and around him is dust, or I guess, stretching a bit to call it dust, but they're chunks, because chunks are much easier to process than dust and also look better in a stylistic setting. So in a way, it does say the title. It does say Dust Remains, just not literally. But yeah, I just wanted to share this before I start streaming the input buffer, because this is what I've been working on for today, and I feel bad for having such short streams recently. Hopefully I can do a longer one tomorrow. I think I also said that yesterday, but here we are. And yeah, I wanted to show the store page because seeing the game actually on the Steam store page is very surreal. Like, I've been wanting to make games for a very long time, and to actually see it on a Steam store page like this close to actually being a game on the Steam store, it's really exciting. It's also allowed me a new perspective at looking at the game, because it's so easy to get bogged down in my own vision of it because I'm the one who makes it, so it's harder for me to look at it with new eyes. But putting it on the store page, it's like as if the surrounding around it like puts my mind into a state of seeing something that's not my creation. Like, I'm actually just a customer on the store page, like I always am if I'm on the store page. And I was looking at it and I was like, this looks like a good game. Like, it's not a game that I look at and I go, oh my god, this is revolutionary, oh my god, I need to get this, oh my god, it looks fantastic. But it is a game that I feel will make people stop and consider it, which it's not much, but it's certainly better than just passing by it. So I think not having text on the cover art also helps to do that. It's like it draws you in. I also think I'm being a bit cheeky with the pipe wrench, because I was going to do a sword. The reason it's a pipe wrench is because a pipe wrench is easier to model than a sword, but also because a lot of immersive sims have a pipe wrench. And although I try to stay away from directly mimicking thing from other games, I thought I'd take the inspiration, since it's been in so many immersive sims, like more than just one, like the idea of using a wrench. I thought it might be a good idea to have that, especially in the cover art, so people can see that, and if they've played any of the immersive sims with wrenches, they can look at that and think, this might be an immersive sim. And then they read the description and see the trailer and they go, yep, it is. So maybe I want to play this. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about it. I don't want to drag on too long. I'm just really excited to finally have it on the store page. It should be up soon, assuming it gets approved by Steam, which I hope it will, because really they only turn down like money schemes and terrible stuff. Like, not terrible as in terrible quality, because it's not, as I understand it, Valve doesn't see it as their job to judge the quality of something. They just judge the validity of it. And I doubt they would look at my game and think this is like not legit, because even if they don't like it, I hope they can see that it's legit. So my hope is it'll be up pretty soon. All right, that's enough of that. I'm going to go on to doing the input buffer, which I still don't know why it's not working, so I'm gonna work to figure that out. Okay, so the reason was that the event is null, and the reason The reason it wasn't working is because we have, if the object event is not null, then we don't check for the input at all. So what we need to do, we can do one of two things. We can attach a blink event that is like no inputs possible, and that way we can check for inputs, but then we're not also checking for inputs that we don't need to check for, if that makes sense. And I think that's the best way to do it, because I think essentially my two options are get rid of this check here to say if the object event is not null, but then at that point we're checking input every time, all the time, which is redundant. So it would be best to only, it would be best to have an event called like the no input possible or something like that, like a static event. Well, a static method that can be tied to the event. That way we can still call through, but it'll return false because we want to store that input. So I think that's the best approach, rather than just completely getting rid of this check, because there will be cases where maybe we don't want the input buffer to happen. So yeah, I'll set that up and then we should be good to go. All right, I think I'm actually going to end it there. I got the input buffer working and did a test run real quick to make sure the frame rate was a editor problem, not a standalone problem. It seems to be just the editor. Sometimes it's really choppy with the frames in editor. I don't know why, but it doesn't seem to be related to the game. So that's good. And yeah, I don't know what to work on right now, so I'm just going to end for now. I'm also pretty tired. Hopefully, well, not hopefully, I will stream longer tomorrow and show more stuff. And the goal for this stream is to work on the player controls. The things I need to improve are the player jump, which is going to involve changing how gravity works, because I think I want to go with a constant rate for gravity over an acceleration. Obviously, acceleration is more realistic to life, but I think in the mechanics of the player code, I think it makes more sense to go with a constant force. And then we could just modify the jump by the speed of the jump rather than having to take gravity into account. And then I want to work on the offhand. What I want to do is have it be one targeted object instead of multiple objects. Ideally, I could do a highlighting on the object, but maybe that won't be possible. The idea for highlighting is that I would be able to grab the properties of the material and change the outline to be thicker, so you can see when you're selecting something. But I'm not sure if that's what I'll go for, just because I'm not sure it'll work. But I want to change it so that the offhand targets one object specifically. That way we don't have this sort of thing where it's targeting a whole bunch of objects. But then I want the infusion to the main hand be a bunch of objects, although I may not set up the infusion right now, but I know I want the offhand to be one object and then the main hand is a whole bunch of objects. So yeah, that's what I'm going to set up right now. Work on those two things, jump and then offhand. If I get all of that done before midnight, which is probably when I'll finish up, I might even go to 2 a.m. I don't know. But regardless, if I finish those with more stuff to do, then I'm not sure what I'll do next. Either player code or moving on to modular actions, because that needs to get done too. Kind of forgot I was streaming, so haven't been really commenting on anything I've been doing, but I was tweaking there for a while how the gravity works. I wanted to change it so that it wasn't accelerating in the way it was before. It's still accelerating, but it's accelerating at a constant rate, whereas before the acceleration itself was changing. So the way acceleration works is acceleration is how much the velocity is changing over time. So if we have a steady acceleration of 1, then it's changing by 1 every second in that velocity. So velocity is increasing by 1 every second. What it was before is that acceleration itself was increasing, which means 1 frame. So let's say, just for example, frame 1, it's increasing by 1. Frame 2, it's increasing by 2. Frame 3, it's increasing by 3. Obviously, that's way more extreme than how the gravity was actually working, but that's how the concept of it, you can think. That's how you can think of it. And I realized it was causing issues with the input where it would kind of cause this jittering effect because it's changing so sharply when it gets to those higher values. Now, I changed it so that it is a steady acceleration. And then I also tweaked it so that it applies a downward force even when we're technically grounded. The reason for that is because the character controller, the component itself within Unity, which helps with like player collisions and stuff like that, its quality of is grounded is not as accurate as it could be. And we can fix that by always applying gravity as a very slight force. So if we're standing still and I'm applying a very subtle gravity, if you're actually on the ground, it won't matter because you're just hitting the ground. The controller says we can't move down because there's a plane below us, so we're not going to move down. But let's say we're just a little bit above the ground, like just tiny amount, and the controller's saying we're grounded, we're good, but it's like not quite sure, and so it's not moving down, or there's like a discrepancy somehow. If we have a very minor decrease in velocity, then it will eventually touch the ground. It'll like slowly go down, touch the ground, and then we're good. So that's why I think it's better to keep a constant gravity even when we're grounded, especially since if it's small enough, you won't notice it. Then what I've started doing is I added a quality so that we can see when an input is held, because the problem I realized with the input buffer, so yesterday what I did is I made an input buffer so that we could store calls. And this works by storing calls that do not successfully fire. So yesterday what I did is I added a Boolean return to all calls, or maybe I did that the day before, I can't remember. But anyways, I set up a Boolean return on all calls so that we can see whether or not an event successfully fires, which is pretty straightforward to do. But what that allows is when we fire an input, we can see whether or not it returns true. And then if it doesn't return true, we store it in the buffer. So if it fails, we restore it in the buffer. You can see that on the right there. If you look, I'm pointing with my finger again. You can see on the right that we have primary, and then our event cache is null, null, null. Now I had to add null as an input enum since you can't send an enumerator to null, but I don't think there's any downsides to having one of the qualities be null. So we attack now, we get that up. So you can hear this input. I'm letting go immediately, but we have to wait 0.2 seconds to cancel a forecast. So the moment I let go, we're actually not ready to attack yet, so it gets stored in the buffer. Now, this is something that is, I probably shouldn't go over this too much because I've talked about it before, but this is something that like all games do, pretty much. If you've played a game where you think that the input is weird, janky, or non-responsive, it's almost certainly in part due to the input buffer. So as we click, you can see now we have an issue where I did it, but it didn't cache the input quite right. So what I want to do is change it to, instead of looking specifically for an up event, I want to change it so that we're looking for whether or not the button is held. Now, prior to this, because of the way my input system works, there's no way to check whether a button is held aside from doing it like hard coding, which is not something I want to do. So if you've worked in Unity before, you know that there's a way to see, you can do input.getButton down, the name of the button, is it being held? Well, not get button down, you just get button. And if that's true, then the button's being held. Now, the problem with that is the input manager is meant to be a way to get input on a non-frame per frame by frame basis. So the entire point of the input manager is to not do stuff like that, where we're checking every frame whether this input is made. Now, if I were to do it for this attack, it's only happening when we're in the forecast phase, but at every frame of the forecast phase. While what I'd rather do is have it as a part of the input manager. So what I did is I went in, and we can go to the script here. What I went in and did was I made it so that we have a way to calculate whether or not the button is held, and that's pretty straightforward. If you're putting the button down, then it's held, and if the button comes up, then it's not held. Axes, we can do just by whether or not it's 0, because an input axis is going -1 to 1, and if it's 0, then you're not touching the button, or joystick if you're doing that. For something like that, what we could do is actually set a sensitivity. So as of now, it's simply whether or not it's equal to 0, but we could do something in the future where it's like whether or not the input axis is less than or equal to 0.01f, like something really small. Because if you think of something like a joystick, it's possible a player will be resting their finger on the joystick and it will be like just barely not 0, or there's like there's this thing that's destined for all joysticks because of the fact that they're hardware and not electrical. Well, I guess transistors are still hardware, but they run on physical parts, joysticks, so they deteriorate over time. So what games can do to counter that is have an input axis that is like this, where if it's less than a certain value, we will not set it to 0. And I actually think I should just set this up now because there's no reason I shouldn't do this. And we can call this is held threshold. Well, axis is held threshold. And we can say that is equal to, for now we can do really, really small. And then I can always look back and tweak this value if I think it needs to be more forgiving. But so there we go. And I did it the wrong way. There we go. If that is less than the threshold. Okay. And then we should also do this, actually. We're going to want the absolute value because it could be negative, in which case it would never be less than this. Okay. So now we have a way to check whether or not the button is held. So you can see held, let go. Now, obviously it's not working yet because I haven't set up the code to check for is held, but I did do that for the movement, which is not working. So I'm going to look at what's wrong with that because it probably has to do with either the way I set up the Boolean or it has to do with the way is held is being calculated on the axes. Maybe that threshold I just put messed it up. But yeah, I just wanted to explain a bit what I was doing because I realized I haven't been talking at all since the introduction. I worked on the jump. I still need to work on the jump a bit more to tweak the values. I want it to be a decelerating jump with a accelerating gravity, but steady deceleration, steady acceleration. Then I also need to still change the offhand. But now what I'm doing is getting this input set up so that we rely on whether or not the button is held rather than relying on the up key, because whether or not it's held is going to be more reliable than the up key. All right, that was probably the issue. I was doing X move for both of these rather than X move and Z move. So hopefully that's the issue. We'll try it again, and then I will set up the other two. Oh, I also did not explain this part. This code's getting a bit out of hand. As I've said before, this is like spaghetti code. You can see by the title of the file, but it is getting a bit out of hand to manage even now. So I'm looking forward to changing all of this to modular actions where hopefully it'll be a bit more comprehensible. But what I'm doing here is I am setting it so that we can pass in either an input parameter, so like whether it's down, held, up, and then also an override which will not rely on whether or not the input's done. So how this works, it's a bit more obvious in the cases where there's two different checks. So let's go to the main hand. Here you can see if idle or down. So we're going to change this real quick, copy it, make an override method, get rid of the need of a parameter, and then get rid of the check for the parameter. And then in this one, what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the check of the state. So all we care about is this input. And then what we can do is just return this so that it fires into that one. So now what we're doing is we're allowed to pass in an input to see whether or not the input is good. So the player's input, but then we can also do an override, which will, so it goes to this, returns this. So it's still processing all of this, even if you call this method, because it's returning this method here. Now, this is something very common if you're overriding a method. At some point, there's going to be overlap in the code. So it's best to return the method that has like the latter half of the code. So what I'm doing here is I'm returning this one, and then we'll check stuff like what the state is. So this is useful so that we can see, is it held? And then we just fire this instead. So if we go down to here, when we switch to forecast, what we want to do is, well, if it is held, then we're going to run input main hand forecast. I believe that's what the method was. Yeah, okay, but we want to. Okay, also, this should be called okay, so now we can call that and basically run it without needing to worry about this input. I'm thinking what we should also do is, I guess we can still attempt that, right? So if it is held, do this. Okay. What I'm thinking the problem is here, it's just going to return false because we go here to attempt and it's going to say, well, this isn't greater than 2, so return false. So what we would want to do is we would want to store the input event that we need. We would want to store this into the buffer. So we want to fake the input. Now, that wouldn't be too difficult to do. We would essentially just call the event, but with the input that we need. The reason I'm tepid to do this is because it relies on the fact that I need to know what the input is for that button, and then if I ever change the input for that button, it's going to mess up this part of it. So, for example, let's say for whatever reason I decide that instead of pressing up to get this, we press down to get it. I guess what I could do is just set it as a variable and then pass in that variable to that call. So what we could do is this instead, and we could call this main hand button skip forecast equals up. So and then what we could do here is instead of just directly calling it, we could do I believe I'm going to pass in is that right? Okay. Also, I think these should be private because it should only be accessed here, right? Let's see. We're gonna get rid of this stuff because I'm realizing we can't do it that way. So what I just explained is not going to be used. We're still going to need this back. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to fix these, get rid of these override methods, and then I am going to set it up so that we fake a call, essentially. We say that because it's held, we're going to send an input of up. Now that should work because we are calling it only when the state is changed. So it's not like this is going to be called multiple times. It's just the moment the state changes, we're checking whether or not it's held. Now that should fix the issue where we're having the down be saved into the input buffer, but not the up saved into the input buffer. Because what's happening, it's very rare. Well, actually it's not that rare because I can reproduce it pretty quickly. But what's happening sometimes is the input buffer, which I can't play until the errors are gone, but never mind, no errors. Okay. Let's hope that the inputs work at the moment. Okay. So let's go to the input buffer. I'm caching these inputs. And sometimes what happens here is I can't do it quick enough. Hold on. Okay, let's just do this. Okay, sometimes what happens is obviously down gets cached before up because you have to press it down before you lift it up. And what will happen is this down gets called the moment we're able to attack and the attack begins. But remember, it's 0.2 seconds till you can use the up to get the up key. So let's say you did this instantaneously, meaning you just like did a click like right away. So down and up are cached into the input buffer at the same exact moment. Well, with like 1 frame of time difference. So although the down has enough time to be caught into the down has enough time to be used, but then 0.2 seconds are going to pass by before the up can be used. So it's gonna fade away from the input cache or the event cache. Now, one thing we could do is add time when an input is used, but that can cause like snowballing effects. And it's not something I want to do where when an input is used, we then add time to the following inputs because maybe that's a bad call in some cases. I can't foresee every single case and say that it would be a good idea to add something like that. But what we can do is change this to be if it's not up on the moment we switch to this state, or if it's not down on the moment we switch to this state, then we can do it. And I think that's a better compromise because it's ensuring that the key isn't being held down, which is something we know will be accurate, and it's not something that's going to complicate the system further. All we had to do was add an is held check, which is probably something I should have had anyways, because there will be even more moments like with checking the player's input axis where we want to see whether or not the button is held. And I think the best approach to doing that would be not firing events when it's up. Well, not purely relying on when the button is up, but instead checking when it is held and also not held. Because in this case, we want to see if it's not held. So yeah, I think that's the better approach, and that's why I have to change it because we would have there would be instances like this where the down is used, but the up is wiped from the cache, and so we don't use it. So And so what we want to do is on the moment the state changes, check if it's held, and then throw that into the cache, which should then work, assuming you don't have a full cache, which is possible. So don't have a full cache. Well, if you have a full cache, it has to be that one of them is up, because your cache can only be down or up, and you can't down without upping. So the only possible sequence is down, up, down, up, down, up, except just rotate, or like they could be at any point. So it could be up, down, up. You get it. So if it's ever full, it's going to have an up in there, which means it doesn't even need it. So we'll be all good. Now, what I am thinking is that it might be the case that these two things would fire at once, in which case you would fire 2 up events. Now, if that does happen, when the time comes for the first one to fire, it'll return true, it'll be good to call, it'll start calling. Then the second one fires, and it should see that the animation has begun but not finished because the other one called it. So we cannot fire yet, and then the call will be canceled. That should be true. Although ideally they just won't overlap like that, because then at the worst case, even if that is true, we're still, well, I guess the best case, we're still wasting time doing that call when we could just not allow those two things to override. All right, I think that's enough of an explanation of that. I think there was one more thing I was going to talk about, but I cannot remember, so I'm just going to get back to working on it. Okay, you can see this working on the right there with the event cache. I'll put my mouse near the mic so you can hear as I'm inputting. So I'm inputting while we can attack, so we just get the up because I'm releasing right away. You'll see if I hold on to it, we won't get a event in our cache if I do it while I'm able to. So if I hold it, then go no input, or no event cache for that. Now, the error would come up where we would do the input. I don't know why. No, it broke anyways. Okay, why? So is held is staying true even though button is absolutely not held. So we can see it's true that it's firing more than once. So I was saying earlier how those things are probably going to overlap, and it seems they are. They're failing, but they're not failing with any issues. Okay, this might be a problem here. Well, no, because it fails a whole lot of times. I think what we should do rather than having this be all in one loop, what we should do is add each of these into the update. Okay, I'm going to take a look at this and try to figure out what's going on. I don't want to just keep mildly commentating on me not knowing what to do. This isn't the entire issue because it was still a problem that isHeld wasn't being tracked, but this needs to come before it. Because it's calling the event, but if the event's set to this, then I guess either way it's returning false, so this probably isn't our issue, but regardless, this should be put beforehand. But I do not know. Well, I can figure what's going on. We're not getting the up input that we need to be getting, so yeah, I'm putting some tests to try to figure it out. I don't want to speak too soon, but I think I've solved the issue. Not necessarily with the input, but with the issue that it was getting set to action state. Yet again, it was another fundamental issue with the way state was checked that I had not realized until this moment. And I will try my best to go through what the issue was. What was occurring was we're checking to see if the state is forecast in the input. So first thing we do, what is the state in? We were checking the state and we're seeing if it was forecast, and it said yes, it's forecast, and it said is the animation playing. So The point of this check is to see whether or not the animation is in transition. If it's transitioning from one animation to another, then we do not want to change the animation, or we do not want to change the state. Now, this other check doesn't have to do with what the error was. So here's our problem. We're checking if the state is forecast, but what we were doing, we were checking what the set state was, which is not synced up with the animation. That's specifically what this is for, is to check the animation is playing. So the problem is that what we were doing is we were instantaneously firing this because of the way the input buffer works. The exact moment we switch states, so this part here, the moment we enter the forecast state, check that the button is held. If it is not held, then fire this call. Now the problem was, since we were doing it literally instantaneously on that call for the state to change, so the moment we call this event, well, actually, the moment we call this event to go to forecast, the exact moment, not a frame later, the exact moment we call this is fired, saying, okay, now check that the input is not held. It is not held. Call this. So in the same exact instance, not a frame later, the same exact instance, we are making two calls. Now the problem is the first call comes through and says, okay, change the state to forecast. So the state is set to forecast, and on that same moment, it is telling the animator transition into forecast. So if it were to be one frame later, the animator would see this call and it would change its current animation to forecast, and its past animation, idle, is transitioning into forecast. So now it would say, this animation is not playing because we are transitioning from idle to forecast. If it was one frame later, that would be true. But this is the exact instantaneous moment. This is happening at the same time. So this is an extremely rare occurrence, in particular to exactly what we're doing here. But it definitely could happen again and again and again, just by extreme luck as someone's playing the game. So it's something that needed to be fixed. And obviously for this input buffer, it needed to be fixed. So what's happening is the exact moment we switch to this forecast state, it tells the animator to start transitioning into forecast. But not even another frame has passed before we go this one and we say, tell it to go to action. So it hasn't transitioned. It hasn't even started transitioning at this call, because this is animation playing. It checks if we're transitioning. And so if we're firing at the exact same frame, we're not transitioning. So that's why this was passing as true. And what I did to figure this out is I was debugging, I was logging. We have, this is like a shorthand to see if the current animation is playing, but we can extend that to see a specific animation. So I could throw in like, is death playing? And obviously that's going to be false because we're not in the death state. So what I did is I was like, okay, something's going wrong here. Is it playing the forecast animation? And I did this and it was false. So at the same time this was true, the same time this line was true, this line was false. And so I was like, well, if it's forecast, how is this true and this is false if it's in forecast? So I realized it had to be the case that this was not accurate to what the current animation was. And so we needed to fix that. So what I did is, okay, so the problem is we're setting the state to a new state, and that triggers the animation to change. But at the same moment, we're checking if the state is where we want to go and is it playing. But what we're doing here is we're actually checking is idle playing, because current animation has not even started transitioning into forecast. Okay, so that's what the problem was. How I fixed it was I went to here, and what we have is on state change within Unity. I guess within C#. What you can do is have get set when a variable is changed. So when this variable is changed, and this is changed on the call. So if we go back here, on this call event, this is when the state's change. We pass an action, and it goes in here, and it sets it. It goes to set, and it does all of this for the action change. Now, I was thinking, well, we could change this to only be set once the animation has been changed, but then we wouldn't be able to do stuff like check that the animation has changed. We wouldn't have this to change it. I mean, we could do value to string, value here, but then we don't have a way to target and see if the animation is playing. So we couldn't just do that because this is supposed to be what the state is. So the state is this. Whether or not it syncs with an animation is a different thing. So what I did here is I said, instead of returning the implicit state, let's return the animation to state. So I made a utility that'll transition an animation into the states. So I made these constant strings, which correspond to idle. I mostly did this because I should have had these a long time ago of static, well, constant strings for the animation names. And so now what we're doing here is we are seeing what is the animation, and this is going to call any variance. So it'll take care of that. And then return the state based on what that animation is. And then we have a default in case we missed something, or it's a string that we haven't seen before. And so now we're returning that instead of what the state is. And so I have my action state anim. So now we are getting what the state is rather than, well, we're getting what the animation is rather than what the state is, which the animation reflects the state. The two things work in tandem, but the animation is going to be delayed while the state is instantaneous. So it's better to check what the animation is, not what the state is. And so that's what the problem was. And this also fixed the calls. So the reason as well that this is fixed is because we have this check within our calls. So we could say that if the input was wrong, like if we were getting that part with the input wrong, it still should have been checked in the calls because we have this, is animation playing. So what really confused me was that this wasn't being caught, but it's because of that problem I just explained, where it's all in the exact instance two calls are being made to switch the state. Because if you were to look at it in terms of just like statistically, what is the probability that two calls would be made on the same frame? It's very, 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 very unlikely, like extremely unlikely. And then what are the odds that that'll happen within one frame of each other? Still unlikely, but not as unlikely. And that's what we were ready for. We were ready for one frame later, another call is made. But we weren't ready for, in this exact frame, two calls were made. So now we fixed that, because this is going to be a fundamental issue throughout all of development, not specifically for this input buffer. I mean, specifically for this input buffer, but not only this input buffer. Okay. I hope that makes it obvious what I was doing here, because I was quite confused what the issue was going into this. And so hopefully explaining it has been helpful. And I think that also solved the issue with the input not firing. So like how it would just stay sometimes. I think now we're finally getting it so that it's calling that input and we're good. Because that was a difficult thing to figure out. Because like it would be very rare, but if I clicked extremely fast, like really fast, it wouldn't catch it, and we'd be stuck in this like it would be like this. But I think we've solved it. Okay, I think I'm going to do something less intensive, and I'm going to replace every instance of strings of the states into those constants, because that's how it should be. We shouldn't be having strings. Whenever we can get rid of strings, we should get rid of strings. So is this even needed anymore? I think I was saying I didn't want to do it this way, but I think actually if we just use value here, we can just do this. No, it makes more sense to return it here because we should be setting it at the moment we want to get it, right? Because if we're setting it only when we set it, then we won't be keeping track of when the animation actually changes. So no, it needs to be there. We could just have this for the actual state because this keeps track of what our state is. So let's say we needed to get the state. We'll get it there. This, I added anim here so that I know it's returning. I guess we can't, can we? Okay. Returns state of the animation, not the action. Okay, return state of the animation, not the action. Okay. I thought I had something like this where it was animation to state. I guess. Yeah, I thought I had something like this, but this works out well. Okay, I'm gonna just start switching this stuff. Hopefully that explanation made sense. All right, I think I'm gonna end things there. 5 hours. Didn't get to fix the player jump as much as I wanted to. Want to do some more changes to that. I had to deal with the input buffer issues, but luckily that's all solved. Got those strings set up. I'm gonna do some more work, but I'm gonna take a break and then not gonna turn back on stream for just an hour. So hopefully I'll be streaming again tomorrow. I don't think I'll be streaming as long because I want to work on a video. But hopefully I can stream tomorrow, and I think I will have some good news tomorrow. We will see. I'm gonna be streaming some work on player code. That's really all I will be doing because I spent most of today working on a video. So just gonna work on player code. I won't be able to get to modular actions until hopefully tomorrow. Tomorrow will be just coding, or at least just working on the game, no videos. So should have a lot more coding to do tomorrow. You can kind of see right here a reason why the old code wasn't good for the sort of systems I want to have in place. Basically, what I'm doing right now is deleting old code. That's why I'm getting all these errors. It was deleted a while ago, but I had to revert the project and then go from a backup. And so these ones are still there, but luckily all the new code I did is also still there. It's just that the old stuff that was deleted is also still here, if that makes any sense. But like you can see the error is we've gotten rid of all the player code, and now the AI is broken because it relied on specific references to the player code. The way I want to set up the game now is that will never be true. The AI is never going to need the player code because it is never going to be reading what the player is doing. Instead, it'll be reading from a global system of a global set of systems which dictate what an object can do regardless of what sort of object that is. So with this new system, we wouldn't get an error if I decided to delete the whole player where the AI no longer functions. Instead, what we have is, well, what I will be building is an AI system that can process things as any sort of object without any reliance on context, like, is this a player? Is this a specific enemy? Is this a specific thing? Instead, we just rely on systems. Okay, so I was trying to figure out the issue there. Basically, what was happening is we could see in the logs that the event was failing to fire. That's what this is right here. So when event fails to fire, then it shouldn't be removed out of the buffer here for the input buffer, but I was seeing that we had a down and up here, and the down was disappearing like almost immediately, even though the action wasn't happening because it was failing. So I thought, well, we must be getting it returned true then if it's removing itself, because it will remove itself if we get a true return. And I went to check, and yeah, that's exactly what's happening. We're getting true. So I went through all the methods that we're going through to get there, and the call is happening from not from here, but from this method. So the method that's attached to the jump event. So we have our input objects that fire events, and those events are tied by I'm setting them on state change. So for this one, like jump in idle is set to input legs idle. Now the problem is that what I should be doing is I should be returning the call, because if you know the last, from like maybe 3 streams ago, the calls were used to be voids, which means they didn't return anything. And then I thought, well, it'd be good to change it to return whether or not the call succeeds, which was pretty easy to set up. But apparently here I didn't re-edit it to return that, because what we should do is not return true, but return the call, because it's possible that we fail to do the jump. And I'm going to double check that we haven't done that anywhere else. Also, what we can do here, so when we're doing this cancel jump, what we can do is put the call in here. And do this. And then maybe put a limiter on it, like effectively this is just a buffer, but specifically here. And we could say so while limiter is less than, well, I guess, yeah, and because we want this to be true, and I guess it would be this, right? While every time it returns false, keep doing this. So if it's false and we're below the limit, then keep going. Yeah, okay. We can do the same thing for this one. Okay, so the issue was that we were just not returning the call when we needed to. Luckily, with the decent debugging I had for that, I was able to figure it out. Okay, now the input buffer is actually working for the jump. It probably wasn't obvious through just watching. I mean, it couldn't have been obvious. But the input buffer wasn't working for the jump. So right now, if you can hear me hitting the jump, I'll try to be loud with it. And you can see it going into the buffer. I'm jumping before we need to, or before we're able to, and I'm still getting that jump. I'll try to explain for a moment what I'm trying to do here. A recurring issue is that as multiple movement inputs are happening, we get this sort of jittering effect as multiple movement effects are being called. So you can see that here. If I jump, it's not exactly obvious going sideways, but if we jump forward, you can see how the screen sort of jitters. And that's because we're trying to move multiple directions at once. Now, those 3 directions are the movement on the ground plane with the feet, well, obviously with the feet, but with the XZ movement, so nothing with jumping. Then on top of that, we have jumping, which is doing a vertical input onto the jump. Then on top of that, we have gravity. So what I just did for a moment is I made gravity, rather than being a move direction that's applied, we just added upon an incoming direction. But this is a problem because if we're firing multiple move calls, then we're essentially doubling, tripling gravity for every move call that's happening at the same time. So I was thinking, okay, well, what we can do is make a move direction that is then added onto, we combine the jump and XZ movement. So like I said, the XZ movement for the player is a call, and then the jump is a call. So there's 2 different calls. And what I was thinking is we could combine those, but I just realized now that that is prone to error. But what we could do, we already have this value for if something is a self movement, meaning this movement is coming from the object on which this script lies. So What we could do is say if it is a self movement, rather than making this character move at this direction, we take this direction input and apply it to a global move direction. And that way we're doing that functionality I was going to set up on the player control, but we're doing it on the movement script so that it happens for everything. And I think that's the better way to approach it. So I'm going to try that and see what I can do with it. But yeah, the idea is to have all self movement be condensed into one call, and then we can also apply gravity to that. So we get one movement rather than like these 3 different movements that are battling each other, causing this jittering effect. Because I think this issue will still be true that if we have 2 calls, it causes the jitter. But let's say if all self inputs are one call, then it's okay that, like, let's say the enemy pushes you, that it causes like a jittering, because it's like it almost adds to the sense that you're being pushed. Like it's going against what you want to do, and it's causing this like feedback you can see on screen, which in reality is just a bug, but it could easily just seem like a artistic choice that it jitters when you're getting pushed because it's against what you're trying to do. You can like see the friction. So yeah, that's the goal. Condense all self movement into one call that is cemented into the system rather than creating a unique case for the player. I think that's the better way to do it. And hopefully I can get it set up correctly. I'm sure I will fail a few times though. It's also probably worth noting that this isn't currently set up to be for every object. That's why we got this error here where it was saying this object doesn't have a character controller. I'm just testing this for the player, which is going to be a character controller. But again, this movement script is meant for literally any sort of object. So if I get this working for the player, I will know it'll work for everything. And then I'll go about setting it up so that it works modularly for every object, just as the rest of the movement script does, where we have like move transform, move rigid body, move character, move nav agent. We'll do the same thing with this for the self movement. But for now, I'm just testing it, making sure the character works. Okay, I think I'm going to end things here. Still need to fix this. Not sure what to do, but it is 5 a.m., so I'm going to hop off. And then hopefully tomorrow I can get this all figured out and working well. I'm going to be working on player code. The goal is to get the gravity working with having a self movement on the movement script, so that all objects have a self movement script or variable that they can use to combine all self movement into one vector that then gets moved on the player or any object, so that it doesn't cause any jittering between multiple movement calls at the same time. Then outside movements can be layered on top of that, which will cause jittering, but it's okay because it's only noticeable from the player's perspective. Like if you're in the player camera, like a player object, and if they're being pushed by an outside force, I think it's okay to have some jittering because they're being moved against their will. So I think it's okay. That's the goal. And then if I get that done, I'm going to be working on the offhand pull and changing how that works. So I'll explain a bit what I've done with the jump. I wanted to get a jump that felt better. And so what I've done is I've created a way of applying gravity by having a vertical velocity, and then that vertical velocity can be changed when the player jumps. So when the player jumps, we change the vertical velocity to a specific amount that is multiplied by the gravity, the absolute value of the gravity. So that way we go up at the same rate we go down, so it feels like a real arc. And then we can decrease that gravity. We can decrease that velocity by gravity, and then we move velocity times time.delta time, so that way it's over time instead of just instantaneously moving. And then we naturally go down because until we are grounded, we add that gravity onto the vertical velocity, which creates a much smoother arc. And we're doing all of this outside of the event calls, which will make it so it's not choppy movement. Now what I need to do is make this part of the modular system because this is kind of just written out. So that's what I need to work on next. Okay, so I'm just testing out the jump a bit more from what I worked on yesterday, and I think it's feeling pretty good with that input buffer, as well as improving the jump arc, and then also adding a change in the character controller while we jump so that we can get higher than we might otherwise not be able to. So for example, here you can see if I jump, I'm not trying to move onto the cliff side, and you can see like we're not making it. But if I jump and then keep moving, we can almost, okay, bad example. Hold on. Okay. There we go. Okay. Then we can make it, even though we can't, our model actually doesn't quite get up there. We have the character model, maybe showing it will make a bit more sense. We have the actual character model shrink up and go higher. So you can see it's getting smaller and then also higher up. And so what this does is, well, firstly, it tracks with the actual legs. So you can see it actually goes to like where the legs tuck up to. So this also acts as collision for attacks. So this gives you some more ability to dodge attacks with the jump, because anything that's below us, we're going to be dodging, and changing the height of that helps that as well. But what it also means is that when we jump, we have a higher stopping point for like where we can land, because if this didn't shrink at all, then when we jumped, the base would be like there, where it's like the whole cylinder. But when we do that, we get to do a little bit higher of a jump, as if we're like grabbing onto that ledge. And you can even see it kind of looks like it's doing that with the feet, despite the fact that it's just sort of the a happy coincidence that it does that. If we jump like that, you can see how that's going. So yeah, I think it's feeling a lot better now with those two things, and then as well as the input buffers, so that as I'm landing, I can press jump and the next one will queue up. So we have that going, and then also we have the delay in saying we're not grounded anymore. So if we go off this ledge and then I jump while I'm midair, we'll still get that jump. So you can see that happen here. Like I'm off the ledge, but we still get that jump, and I'll try to do it a little bit further. I didn't quite get it that time, so let's go. You see we still get it. Even though you could see gravity starting to take effect, we still got that jump. Now, one issue you can see happening here is that the animation is getting canceled as the character controller thinks it's grounded, or our ground check thinks it's grounded. So that's the issue there, where we jump into the wall and kind of fall. But I don't know if that's an issue I'll want to fix, simply because it just discourages you from jumping right up next to a wall. But if you get further, no, it should be something I fix, because it looks a bit weird to be able to do that jump here but then not do it from here. But yeah, overall I think it's feeling a lot better. And then I guess one thing I could add is an increase in jump height based on whether or not you hold that. Okay, I'm gonna do that and then work on offhand stuff. I think I'll actually end things there. I've got the offhand set up to fire a raycast, and that raycast can grab objects. Luckily, I can use the same code I had before. I just change how we get targets. But I want to make it a bit better than the other version, considering we can't just easily switch targets. So I want to create an outline effect during the forecast to give some indication about what you're about to grab, and then change the speed so that we can grab things and they don't fling towards us. And then also decrease the range on it so you can't do it from an infinite range. But it ended up being a lot easier to set up than I thought it would be, which is nice.